Hi, and welcome back to my channel, Pathways to God and Significance. On this channel, what I do is I present talks that I've given at my church recently. And this particular talk is aimed especially at people of my church, but maybe even if you're not a member of the church, you might find this a helpful thing to listen to. So I'd like to think about people sharing stories about their lives as followers of Jesus. And what I like to do is generally I like to encourage people to share some of those stories. And I think that when we do share those stories in a church setting, or maybe a small group, or maybe one-on-one over coffee, when we share stories about what God's been doing in our lives, it's a great encouragement to the listener, and of course the person talking gets some feedback, so it becomes kind of a two-way conversation of encouragement, reflecting on how God has been walking with the person. Now, I like to think about these stories as snapshots, and you might have snapshots of God's goodness in your own life that you can share with other people, or you might know a story of how God has helped you or helped someone else. And when there are opportunities to share those stories, I would encourage them. But that can sound kind of positive, but the thing is, it turns out that not everyone is completely comfortable with hearing personal stories. Sometimes they're called testimonies, especially if they're quite long. And the reason for that is simple. People don't always tell the truth, or they might want to tell the truth, but for one reason or another, things go sideways. Many years ago, I was in a Christian music group, and we toured parts of the United States, and I would meet different Christian musicians, and many of them had a personal testimony that they would share during the performances of their bands. And I remember one musician in particular. He was a drummer, a very likable young guy. I've got many fond memories of him. He had an interesting testimony. His story went like this. He was once in a band that was just starting out. His not famous band was booked to open for the 70s rock artist Alice Cooper. You might remember him if you were around that time, but I think Cooper's been active since then too. Anyway, the drummer said that on this one particular night they were booked to open for Cooper, and Cooper's drummer fell ill. Well, what to do? So Cooper asked my friend, the drummer in the not famous band, to fill in for the sick drummer. So he did. He filled in. And at one point in Cooper's music set, there was a drum solo, and my friend said that when it was time for that drum solo and the spotlight hit him, that he was just terrified. But he said it was Jesus who got him through that moment and got him through the entire concert. That's kind of a cool story, and it got the attention of a lot of teenage boys and girls. The only thing is, I don't know if it was completely true. Knowing the drummer a little, I'm pretty sure he was very well intentioned, and he was doing his best to provide a story that was relatable for his audience, and a story that would encourage young people to consider Jesus. But was the story totally true? I mean, likely there was a concert where the drummer for the first time had to play a drum solo in front of a large audience, and maybe he was filling in for another drummer, but probably it wasn't Alice Cooper's drummer that he was filling in for. And it seemed to me that this drummer kind of let his imagination run away with him in an effort to present a story that, while true in many ways, was a bit of an exaggeration. And that's the trouble with hearing impressive stories from others about what God has been doing in their lives. You don't always know if the teller of the story is being completely truthful, or if he or she is maybe fudging on some of the details to make an impression. So naturally, many people are a little skeptical of impressive personal testimonies. And this reminds me of something that Dr. Charlie Taylor Some of the people in my circles know Charlie Taylor when he worked with adult prison inmates, and some of them like to dwell on their sensational, sinful past and then tell how Jesus had changed them. And Charlie would say that it's better not to tell many sensational stories about past sins with many details about drug dealing and violent acts and sex trafficking and so on, followed by many details about how Jesus has changed the storyteller. Wouldn't it be wiser, Charlie Taylor asked, just to make a sober, brief mention of past sins and crimes, and then simply to point others to Jesus Christ by quiet word and example? But now you may be wondering, do you and I, do we have to come up with a long story about how Jesus has changed our lives? And I've already hinted that maybe that's not the best thing, but sometimes, we wonder, do I need to generate a long story of how, my past and then how God has made things better? And I would say that no, you don't need to. And I think that something like a snapshot will be best. And maybe that'll be a bit of a relief to you if you've been thinking that you have to create a large narrative of your life. And I think that something like a snapshot or a series of them is the best thing partly because it's of what we find in the Bible, or maybe what I should say, it's what we don't find in the Bible. In the Bible, we do not find long personal stories in which the storyteller tells us about past sins and errors and gives us many details about her or his new life. We don't find that. Who are some of the people that we meet in the Bible? Well, we meet Abraham, who sometimes told big lies to stay out of hot water. Sarah, his wife, is known for laughing at God's promise of a child. Jacob, their grandson, was a first-rate schemer. Moses lost his temper and got himself disqualified from entering the promised land. King David, even in his later years, when he'd been walking with God a long time, spent too much time counting his troops to see how strong his military was instead of trusting more in God. Those are examples from the Old Testament about some of the flawed characters we see. And what about in the New Testament? Well, we meet Thomas, a bit of a doubter, Peter, a hothead who abandoned Jesus at one point, Paul was a terrorist to the early Christians, and even with just the tiniest bit of reading between the lines in the New Testament, we see that the early Christians had a hard time to stop lying, stealing, and lazing around. Some apparently like to walk around the church as if they were really quite something. These people behaved, all these people that I've just mentioned, behaved in these ways, even though they were the people of God, even though they were among his people, they struggled to live in the way that God had directed them. And it seems to me that the people who we meet in the Bible would not very quickly say, I was a very bad person and here are a lot of details, but now that Jesus has a hold of me, I'm a much better person and here are a lot more details about that too. They would most likely say something like, I'm a follower of God, but I still have a long way to go. Life is still difficult, and I struggle every day with weaknesses and sins. Well, it turns out that there is one kind of testimony that we do find in the Bible, and they are not testimonies. It's not a testimony focused on a person. We find testimony focused on God. For example, Psalm 145. I'll read just a couple of verses. Verse 4, one generation commends your works, God's works, to another. They tell of your mighty acts. They speak of the glorious splendor of your majesty, and I will meditate on your wonderful works. They tell of the power of God's awesome works, and I will proclaim your great deeds. Do you see the drift of what I'm saying? The focus in the Bible is not on a person's actions or, great new life with God. The focus in the Bible is on God's actions, God's works, God's mighty deeds. So what kind of testimonies do we find in the Bible? Testimonies of what God has done. Not so much testimonies of how a person has been changed from a life of sinning to one of good behavior, but testimonies about God's actions. So sometimes in the Psalms there are detailed stories of God rescuing his people from slavery or from starvation or from wartime enemies or from exile. There are praises to God for delivering people from personal sins and even from death. In the Psalms, then, the action is not on how much the writer has changed, but it is on what actions God has done to save his people. Now, does that mean that there is no room in our lives when we're following God for personal testimony? And I would say that yes, there is a kind of personal testimony that we should strive to present, and that is that it's a testimony of when our actions, when our lives line up with our faith, with our words. The writers of the Bible are sharp, and they know very well what we know. Words are cheap. It is deeds that show our true colors. James writes in chapter 2 of his booklet, "What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such a faith save them? Suppose a brother or sister without clothes and daily food, and if one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, keep warm and well fed,' but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is that? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead." So our testimony is a life lived that lines up with what we believe, with the words of our faith. And I think that this is completely in keeping with Jesus' own thinking. He disapproved of the religious leaders of his time, not because they didn't say the right things. They did at times say the right things. They taught the law of God, but they did not practice what they preached. In Matthew 23, Jesus says, "The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must obey them and do everything they tell you. But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach." Jesus did not object to much of what the teachers taught. He did not accept, however, that their actions did not line up with their words. Their testimony, in other words, was defective. Our most effective testimony is not what we say, although we should also say the right things. Our most effective testimony is when our actions line up with our words. Well, okay, now let's go back to the idea that I mentioned earlier on, this thing about snapshots, because I think that telling short stories about how God has been active in our lives can be a great help to people. Not a long narrative, describing what a great person I am, but snapshots of how God has been at work. Less a long story that covers years of past history, and more of, here are a few moments in which I believe God has been at work in my life. My life generally, may be a struggle. I think for many of us it is, but nevertheless, there are moments, there are snapshots when we see God's grace, and the hope that I would have is that people in my church or wherever you may be will freely share these snapshots. And the great thing about a snapshot is that it's not a claim of all the great things that God has been doing over the long term, but it's more, as I said, here are some moments that I'm really grateful for, moments in which I'm sure God was putting things together for me. So here's one snapshot of my own, and that's where I'll end this morning. Sometimes I get discouraged in my work, and I wonder what difference it makes. But then at just the right moment, someone will say something that helps me to keep going. It encourages me to keep going. And I had a moment like that about a week or two ago. A couple of weeks ago, a youth who has been in custody texted me. In other words, he was a youth offender, a young offender, and I met him during my work at the local youth correctional facility. So this youth, I'll just call him Ben, he would attend the worship times at the youth center once a week, and between those times, he and I would sometimes chat. We would have short prayers, and he's been out of custody for several years now. But he texted me a couple of weeks ago to say that he lives in a nearby town called Yarmouth, and could he come by sometime, and we could meet. He said, my parents are going to be out your way, and I can go with them, and we could meet maybe. So we did. We met about a week ago at a local coffee shop, and as I said, it had been a few years, and so when I first saw him there, I entered the coffee shop, and there he was, and I kind of recognized him, and I sat down and we started talking, and oh yes, that's the youth I remember. And he said to me, he said, if it hadn't been for the work that you did with me, I would have ended up in a lot more trouble. And several times he said, my life was changed because you and I met. Well, his parents were waiting outside in their truck, and after Ben and I had chatted for a few minutes, we went out to see them. It was raining. The parents were sitting high and dry in their Ford F-150, and they went on for quite a while about how often Ben would talk about his interactions with me, and about how he was now working for his dad in his garage, I think it was, and how Ben had become involved with the local church for quite a while now, and he was planning on being baptized very soon. The parents were talking, and meanwhile I was getting wet, yet I didn't want to interrupt the parents because it was clear how much joy they were having in talking about the changes to their son. And for me, this was a great moment for all of us there, a great moment for Ben, for his parents, for me. There, in a rainy coffee shop parking lot, we shared the goodness of God. And I drove back home that afternoon, my heart full, sensing God's blessing and God's encouragement to keep reaching out with the stories and the love of Jesus Christ, and to keep reaching out to whoever God puts in my path and wherever God may place me. Well, if you've got a snapshot or a number of snapshots of God's goodness, I hope that you will share them when you have a chance. And thanks so much for being part of Pathways this week. I hope that the rest of your week goes great. May God bless you, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.